Burning questions.
Insightful answers.
Listener's choice.
With Clement Manyathela.
On our Listener's Choice feature this morning, we are discussing the difference between a peacekeeping mission and a peace enforcement mission. One of our listeners asked that we discuss this. As you will remember, the death of South African National Defence Force soldiers last month in the Democratic Republic of Congo has brought into sharp focus the role of South Africa in peacekeeping missions. There have been a number of questions asked about why we do peacekeeping missions. And of course, the country has been involved in peacekeeping missions for years now. I think it provides about 1,189 personnel to the United Nations peacekeeping, which makes it the 15th largest contributor among all the United Nations member states. But while some of these missions may have peace as an objective, they're not fully peacekeeping missions. And that's why it's important for us to bring in someone who can take us through what the difference is, and particularly look at our soldiers that are currently deployed in the Eastern DRC and what the objective is there. So we've invited Dean Wingrin, who is a defense analyst, to guide us through this conversation. If you've got your own questions about our deployment to the DRC or other parts of the continent as part of the peacekeeping missions, you're welcome to call us on 011-883-0702 or send WhatsApps on 072-702-1702. Dean, thank you for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement. Thank you.
Let's start with that difference. Is there a difference, and what is it between a peacekeeping mission and a peace enforcement mission?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and I'm glad one of the listeners has brought it up. Because when we talk about peacekeeping and we hear politicians saying, oh, we've got peacekeepers here and we've got peacekeepers there, you know, we get this warm and fuzzy feeling in us, you know. We're thinking of peacekeepers as, you know, neutral people. They're keeping the calm, they're helping the local population, and so on. And I can understand also when politicians talk about peacekeepers and not referencing peace enforcement as such, sort of when they're talking about peacekeeping missions in a general sense. But when it comes to speaking to a specific mission, then I think it's very important that you actually distinguish between what is a peacekeeper and what is a peace enforcer. And as we have in the DRC, we constantly trying to correct our politicians and even one or two military people that what we got there in the DRC at the moment is not peacekeepers, but we've got a peace enforcement mission. And so it's good that we discuss the differences. And right off the bat, I'm going to say that, you know, the lines between the two can be blurry. And like anything, you know, these missions change over time. Original mandates get updated, they change. The situation on the ground also changes. So what we'll talk about initially is just in general terms. So when we talked about a peacekeeping mission, you know, this is generally independent grouping of countries, and they will send peacekeepers to a particular region that has already been consented to by the different parties involved in the conflict. So the various sides would have already chatted to each other. They would have already come to some sort of ceasefire agreement. And both of them would have said, yes, we want an independent party to come between us. We've got peace at the moment, you know, peace in quotation marks, and we want to keep it like that for the foreseeable future until we can do something more permanent. Okay,
in other words then, Dean, just to correct me if I'm wrong here, in the case of, for instance, the DRC, let's be practical, if it's a peacekeeping mission, then the M23 and maybe the DRC army or the DRC government would have at least spoken and said, okay, we've reached a level of peace in inverted commas, and we need an independent party to come and help us, keep that consistently. Is that what would be applicable then, to use your analogy?
Exactly. So these peacekeepers they focus on monitoring the ceasefire. And then ancillary to that, they'll provide humanitarian assistance and so on, and, protect the local civilians.
Yeah. But then in this case, in the DRC, there was no ceasefire between,
Exactly.
we arrived there, even the SANDF general said, we are there to help the DRC army neutralize negative forces. And I assume by negative forces, it refers to the M23 rebels, which puts us on an enforcement mission now. We're no longer just here to implement a ceasefire. There wasn't one.
Exactly. So the peace enforcement would mean that you now go into an area without the consent of everybody there. So the peace enforcers are then invited by one party to the conflict. In the DRC, it will be by the Congolese government and with their consent. So there is no peace as we understand it there at the moment. So the focus of the peace enforcement mission is to stop any hostilities, to disarm, the combatants, and try and enforce some sort of peace agreement for the protection of the local population and so on. So whereas a peacekeeping mission is neutral and impartial, a peace enforcement mission is not very impartial at all.
Yeah.
Because they're there to take the side of one party in the conflict.
And when you look at the government that the position that our government has taken, the approach is we clearly have taken a side here. So how are we peacekeeping when we have already taken a side? Because I think our government, our soldiers have been very clear in that we are siding with the DRC army. In fact, what Rwanda has been complaining about is that we could potentially be fighting alongside the FDLR, which is another rebel group in the DRC. So we clearly have taken a side here, then, Dean, to fight against the M23 rebels with the DRC army. And the question then is that why then we are also on the offensive and we've lost our soldiers? Because the lines have been blurred here. So we may be thinking, okay, we're here with M23, but we are here with the DRC army. But actually what you're doing is you are saying to the M23, we are also coming against you here.
Exactly. And that is why I get so frustrated when I hear the Minister of Defense, the President, Chief of the Army talking about peacekeeping in the DRC. South Africa's got about a 25-year history of peacekeeping missions in Africa. When we initially joined the UN mission in the DRC, it was called MONUSC in 2013, and then about a year later changed it to the MONUSCO acronym. It was a peacekeeping mission. And when you go on a peacekeeping mission, the forces you take are relatively lightly equipped because they're not going into a combat situation. They're there for self-defense. They're taking whatever weapons they take is for self-defense and to protect any civilians. But in 2013, the UN Security Council mandated a new force intervention brigade as part of MONUSCO. And this is very much also a offensive mission. And so if you look at sort of the mandate of this force intervention brigade, they also talk about carrying out targeted offensive operations, to prevent the expansion of armed groups, to neutralize these groups and disarm them. So you can see that the SADC mission that we also are part of at the moment has very similar mandate. And when you're in that sort of situation, it's no longer self-defense. You are now going on the offensive. And as a result, you take better and bigger and more complex weapons with you. Your self-defense systems and the way and where you base yourself, it's a very different way of thinking. You need air support. You need a highly mobile and robust logistics system to support you. And I'm afraid that just because 20 years ago we were in a peacekeeping mission, it doesn't mean we're still in a peacekeeping mission. And our whole viewpoint and way you go about your task and your mission must change.
The
and it must
strategy has
evolve.
to change. Yeah, absolutely. Dean, I'm going to take a quick ad break. It's 18 minutes after 11 o'clock. I want to give our listeners an opportunity to also ask you some questions around our soldiers' deployment in the DRC or in any other part of the continent as part of peacekeeping missions. What's your question? What's your input? Give us a call on 011-883-0702. WhatsApp's on 072-702-1702. We're discussing the difference between a peacekeeping mission and a peace enforcement mission. This is a topic that one of our listeners suggested via our email line, cm@702.co.za. Dean has explained what makes it a peacekeeping mission and what makes it a peace enforcement mission. Are we ready for enforcement? We may have gone there as a peacekeeping mission, but things have changed. Are we ready? And has our strategy changed to align with what is the reality on the ground in the Eastern DRC? It's 19 after 11.
Burning questions.
Insightful answers
Listener's choice.
with Clement Manyathela.
22 minutes after 11 o'clock. We've been talking since 11 o'clock about the difference between a peacekeeping mission and a peace enforcement mission. So any question related to this that you have or input, you're welcome to join this conversation. Let's start with Lunga, who's calling us from Pretoria. Lunga, what are your thoughts? Good morning.
Good morning, Clement. How are you?
Good. Go ahead.
Good, thanks. Clement, I share the same frustration as Dean on the basis that we hear a number of comments on TV, mainly by politicians who might do better if they consult before they unintendedly mislead the public. Basically, there's a distinction between a peacekeeping and a peace enforcement mission, as Dean is saying. But to help the public better, one can simply look at the UN Charter. Chapter 6 of the UN Charter makes reference to a peacekeeping mission, where indeed there's sort of stability in the country, and perhaps there is a ceasefire agreement. Sometimes there is not, but you simply send soldiers to keep the peace and protect the civilians. Whereas in terms of Chapter 7 of the same charter, you then send soldiers while the other party to the conflict does not agree with you sending soldiers. And in doing so, we are then involved in a peace enforcement mission. So the public can simply check the difference between the two by going to the UN Charter rather than listening to what we hear on TV from people who do not understand the difference between the two, mainly politicians.
Got it. Lunga, thank you so much for your thoughts.
Hi, Clement. Thank you for a great show. Could you please ask your guests what other interests South Africa might have in the DRC? I'm thinking of mining interests, for example.
All right, thank you so much for that. Dean, there's that question there. Another one coming from one of our listeners is, who pays for these peacekeeping missions? So if South Africa agrees to be part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, do we have to contribute as South Africa, or is money coming from, I don't know if it's a SADC-led peacekeeping mission, it is SADC countries, or is it the United Nations member states?
Thanks very much for those. I'll just answer quickly the funding one first. That all depends on the actual mission. Generally, if you're on South Africa, our peacekeeping, peace enforcement missions are largely focused from three different sources. It's the UN, it's the African Union, and it's from SADC, the South African Development Community. So if you're on a UN mission, then generally the UN has a very complex and comprehensive mandate with each country. And that stipulates the type of equipment that must be provided and its state and its condition and its usability and so on. And the UN will then refund their contributing country for the use of that equipment, as well as for the number of troops that have been deployed and so on. So the big answer is, on a UN mission, the UN refunds the country.
Okay.
But being the UN is very bureaucratic, and a country like South Africa has to get its paperwork in order, the T's crossed, the I's dotted. The UN will only pay for equipment that is in working condition and so on. So not everything South Africa expends on, say, the MONUSCO UN mission in the DRC will be refunded, but the vast majority of it will be. When it comes to the AU and the SADC missions, there we're not quite as lucky, in that sometimes the AU or SADC will make a small contribution to cover the costs. Sometimes they say they will and they don't, and other times they don't say anything, and of course then the contributing country like South Africa is left to pick up the tab. So it's very much South Africa that pays for the AU and SADC missions, and the vast majority of the UN missions is refunded. On the mining question, yes, that's one that comes up pretty often, and those stories have been going around for decades already. First, it was we were in Central African Republic, and we were in the DRC to protect mines owned by Zuma. Then it was, some other conglomerates, and then it was now it's morphed into Ramaphosa's mines and so on. But I've never seen any actual concrete evidence of this. Yes, there are South African mines in the area, in the DRC, in the eastern DRC, as there are in a number of other places in the world. But South African troops are not going there specifically to protect these mines. I've spoken to a number of soldiers who have been deployed to the DRC, even some where the bases just so happen to be close to a South African affiliated mine. And not one of them has said that they've had to go to the mine for whatever reason.
Okay.
The mine is not even mentioned. So I think a lot of these Rwanda has, an N23, has a very strong propaganda and disinformation social media campaign.
Yeah, and that's just been part of it as well. Here's a quick last question before we wrap up.
Good morning, Clement. My question is, in situations of peace enforcing missions, like in the DRC, when our soldiers die, who should be held accountable or prosecuted? Thank you very much. Peter Maila Machaba from Letswana.
Dean?
Yes. The soldiers are members of the Defence Force. And as a member of the Defence Force, they are members of the group life insurance scheme, which is a condition of service. So they can choose a premium as to, that they're comfortable with, and that will determine the payout that they get. And as well as, should they be killed while on duty, the beneficiaries will also get a pension, the pension payout. But that's pretty much where the Defence Force's obligations end. I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but but I mean, hearing from the families, of the 14 deceased now, even they're saying just basic things like just being kept updated and of what is happening. Even there, it just seems that the Defence Force has been overwhelmed with what has happened.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they're actually caring for the families, as much as what they could have.
Yeah. Dean, thank you so much, as always, for making time for us. Dean Wingrin is a defense analyst. It's 11:30.